Hello everyone and welcome to the Alström Heart series, where our Alström Syndrome Global Director Anne Chivers will be discussing everything to do with the heart with Professor Rick Steeds. There are 6 short episodes in this series and we hope you enjoy them. Please do give us feedback and also do let us know of any topics that you would like to hear about in the future. You can also find more information at www.alström.org.uk.
First of all, just a brief introduction to what we're going to do today, which is to talk all about the heart. My name's Anne Chivers. I work for Alström Syndrome UK, and I do most of our global work. I'm going to let Rick introduce himself. Professor Steeds will introduce, exactly what he does. So over to you, Rick.
Okay, so my name's Professor Rick Steeds. I'm a full-time clinical cardiologist at Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, and I look after the cardiac side or the heart side of all of the patients in the UK with Alström syndrome. In addition to that, I am also a Deputy Clinical Director in the Institute of Cardiovascular Science at the University of Birmingham, and I have a couple of fellows who are doing basic science into Alström cardiomyopathy.
Splendid. Thank you. And so thank you very much for agreeing to do this. Our kind of purpose really is to get people to have some information, kind of give them some updates, and just talk in general about, first of all, the heart as a whole, and then look at the Alström heart and touch on some of the tests and the meds that are given to people and their purpose. So just starting off with a bit of a general overview, really, Rick, and keeping it very simple. What exactly does the heart do?
So, I like simple. The heart is just a pump. It's a very clever pump, but it has one purpose, and that is to pump blood through the lungs to pick up oxygen, and then to pump that oxygenated blood around the rest of the organs, muscles, bones, everything else around the body to deliver the oxygen to keep those tissues, organs alive. It's a clever pump because it does it in an extraordinary way, from a little baby and up until you're old. And it's very much structured in the same way. If you think about a water pump, for example, that pumps out into a fountain, into a pond, or it's a pump that pumps petrol out through into a diesel motor. So it has a number of components. There's the muscle, which works to squeeze the blood out of the heart and pump it round. But it does it in a timed fashion. So it has an electrical circuit that tells it when it needs to pump or when it needs to squeeze the blood out, and also when it needs to relax and recharge and refill so that it can pump out the next time. The heart itself is a muscle, so just like an ordinary pump, it needs some petrol to be delivered to it. So to get that petrol to the muscle, to keep the muscle of the heart going, it has pipes called coronary arteries that deliver oxygenated blood back into the heart muscle itself to keep it going. So when you think about the heart, there is a muscle pump, an electrical supply to tell it when, and in fact your heart has 3 sources of electrical supply, 3 so-called pacemakers in the sinoatrial node, the atrioventricular node, and the heart muscle itself. And those coronary arteries delivering oxygenated blood into the muscle to keep the pump going. And that is a left main stem branching into left anterior descending artery, a left circumflex artery, and a separate right coronary artery going around the back of the heart. The heart itself is divided into 4 chambers. There are 2 little antechambers. So anyone who knows about pumps will know that big pumps have something called a primer pump, or a little tiny pump that works to jet a tiny amount of petrol or blood into the main pumping chamber called the ventricle. In your heart's case, there are 2 sides to the heart. Each side of the heart has a primer pump called the atrium and a main pump called the ventricle. And it's divided into the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart has the purpose of pumping blood that comes back in the veins without oxygen up into the lungs, refreshes the oxygen in the blood, back into the left atrium of the left ventricle, and then pumped out into the aorta, which is the name of the tube that takes it into your head and neck and down your arms and down into your legs.
So we've got this kind of constant circular movement. Is that right?
Yeah, in order for the heart to make sure that the blood only travels in one direction, because of course if it gets mixed up, it's very inefficient. So you also have 4 valves that mean that every time a pump works, so that in the right side of the heart, the right atrium lets blood into the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. And as soon as the right ventricle is full and needs to pump it up through into the lungs, the tricuspid valve closes, the right heart pumps, the pulmonary valve opens and lets the blood into the lungs. So that it can refill, the tricuspid valve opens, the pulmonary valve closes, and then the blood circulates through the lungs into the left atrium. And then the same cycle is repeated on the left side. Very, very slightly different times. Basically, the mitral and tricuspid valves work at the same time, and the aortic and pulmonary valves work pretty much the same time. So the blood with oxygen goes back into the left atrium, the left prime pump, through the mitral valve, that opens up into the left ventricle. And then when the left ventricle is full and needs to pump, the mitral valve closes, it squeezes blood out through the aortic valve, and as soon as it's empty, the aortic valve shuts to make sure that it doesn't flow back into the heart. So all of the valves make sure that the pump only pumps in one direction to deliver maximum efficiency. Now, usually, just with that description, you would think that the heart actually just works almost like a passive pump. So it opens up, fills, and then squeezes and lets the blood out. But your heart is incredibly clever, and it does something a little bit special. So it actually twists. If you imagine that you've got one end of a cloth in your left hand, and you've got the bottom of the heart in your right hand, and you need to wring out that cloth, actually what the heart does is it moves your right hand close to the left hand, but actually wrings the blood out. It doesn't just squeeze it out. And that means that the blood goes in a spiral movement, which is really super energy efficient, out into the aorta. What's even more clever is that when it comes to the cloth or the heart unringing itself, it actually then does that in a positive way. So it works very much like a bellows. I don't know if people still have fires, but an old pair of bellows has 2 handles and 2 flat pans, and what you do is you suck air in and then you puff it out into the fire to make the fire go. Your heart does the same thing. It squeezes blood out, but then it opens up in such a way that it sucks it back into the heart to fill up super efficiently and extra carefully.
I very much liked your sound effects with that one. Okay, so it's fairly extraordinary organ in our bodies that we're perhaps not always taking the greatest care of. But I think for most of us, our kind of knowing about it, one of the things that comes to mind is how many beats do we have a minute? What happens? Is it the same for everybody, or is
it different? So your heartbeat usually should be somewhere between 60 and 100 beats per minute. Heartbeats will vary a little bit. So if you're younger and fitter, you'll tend to be at the lower range. Your heart rate doesn't particularly necessarily change with age. It tends to slightly go up over time. It doesn't differ between men and women, but it does depend on other things. So it'll go slower if you're much fitter because your heart is much more efficient. So really, really fit athletes can have heart rates that go down to 30 or 40 beats per minute.
Oh.
If you're anxious and you're worked up, you might have a heart rate that runs at 100 110 beats a minute. Football managers who are watching an exciting game of football, they've had their hearts measured, and often they run heart rates at 120 beats per minute with very high blood pressures. So there are other external things that change your heart rate, and of course it will respond to what you do. So if you're having a little snooze, your heartbeat will be much slower. and it tends to go slower overnight for that. Then if you're running for a bus, of course, it'll go a bit faster because your heart needs to work a bit harder. So your heart is clever because it will respond according to what oxygen the rest of your body demands. So of course, as soon as you start to do things, let's supposing you're going to go and lift some weights, you would need much more blood pumped to your biceps or wherever you're working, and your heart rate will go up. And also your blood pressure, systolic blood pressure tends to go up. And what's also important is that your heart realizes actually that then you've got not only got to increase the heart rate, because that means that you produce more blood pumping out per beat, but it will also understand that it needs to leave a little bit longer to fill up and pump out a bit more. So the heart is very clever because it has sensors that means that it pumps out what you need. You don't have to think about telling your heart how much it's got to pump. It does it automatically. It is the most efficient pump you've ever seen.
So is there a kind of normal range of, how many beats per minute?
Yeah, so it's somewhere between 60 and 100 beats per minute. If it's slower than 60 beats per minute, we call it sinus bradycardia, which means it's slow. And if it's faster than 100 beats per minute, we call it sinus tachycardia, which means it's a bit faster than we would expect. And 95% of the population will have resting or will have heart rates on average between those values per minute.
Okay.
Now, also, there is an interesting theory. So I wrote a paper for the British Medical Journal about 30 years ago, which is the first time I come, and then there's been some studies following up after this. And actually, your heart rate is thought that potentially, maybe, you might, over a certain lifespan, have a certain number of heartbeats. And if you explore that in the animal kingdom, a little animal like the mouse has a resting heart rate of somewhere around about 200 beats per minute, 250 beats a minute, and lives for around about 3 years. If you look at a whale, a humpback whale, and I don't know what the weight is, pretty big, they have a resting heart rate of around about 10 beats per minute, and they can live for up to 100 years. And so, it's very interesting to speculate about whether or not your resting heart rate is an indicator. And actually, big studies in hundreds of thousands of people have suggested that actually people who have a higher resting heart rate tend to live a little bit shorter. People who have a slightly slower heartbeat tend to live a little bit longer. But of course, I've already told you there's something called a confounder there. So I've already told you that exercise makes your heart a bit more efficient and it slows your heartbeat. So you don't know if you're living longer because your heartbeat's slow or just actually because most people with slower heartbeat tend to be a bit fitter than the people that have faster heartbeat.
Okay. So it sounds as if that one's yet to be proved.
Yeah, it's difficult because you've got to separate out different issues. There are so many factors that change your heart rate from health and disease can change your heart rate.
Okay, that's kind of quite a nice introduction really into talking about the Alström heart.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick and Anne, for an informative session. Don't forget you can find further information on our website, www.alström.org.uk.